A company has made the exact same product, in the exact same American city, under 5 unbroken generations of the same single family, for more than a century and a half, surviving 2 full world wars, the Great Depression, and a complete material revolution in its own industry without ever being sold off, broken apart, or swallowed by a larger conglomerate, the way so many comparable manufacturers covered in this history eventually were, from machine tool builders to packaging companies to toy makers alike. And yet, despite all of that remarkable continuity, the company does not actually own the most famous name it ever created, the very name printed on nearly every professional bat used in the sport of baseball today. That name belongs to someone else entirely now, sold away quietly in the 21st century while the family kept right on making the physical product underneath it, in the very same building, on the very same machines, for the very same sport it had served since the 1880s. This is the story of Hillerich and Bradsby, the company behind the Louisville Slugger, and of exactly how a firm can survive absolutely everything history throws at it across 170 uninterrupted years, and still end up handing over the one single thing that made it famous in the first place, all without the company itself ever actually failing at anything along the way. The story begins with a German immigrant named J. Friedrich Hillerich, who arrived in Baltimore with his family in 1842, part of the same wave of 19th century German immigration that reshaped so many American manufacturing cities during this period, bringing with it skilled trades and craft traditions that would go on to anchor entire local economies for generations, before eventually settling with his family in the booming young city of Louisville, Kentucky in 1856, a city of more than 20,000 people at the time and growing quickly on the strength of river trade and a rapidly expanding manufacturing base of its own. After apprenticing under his own father in the woodworking trade, learning the craft the traditional way, rather than through any formal schooling, Hillerich opened a woodworking and barrel-making shop of his own downtown, a business he called job turning. And it is worth understanding exactly what that name meant in practice, since the underlying technique would end up defining the company's entire future, without anyone involved realizing it yet at the time. A wood lathe rotates a blank piece of wood at high speed, while a craftsman holds a cutting tool steadily against it, shaping the spinning material into a smooth, precisely rounded profile far faster and far more consistently than carving the same shape by hand ever could manage. Hillerich used that same core technique, wood lathe turning, to produce an enormous range of ordinary household and industrial goods that had absolutely nothing to do with sports at all. Roller skids, bedposts, 10 pins and duck pins for bowling alleys, and even entire wooden bowling balls. A broad general woodworking business built on steady, reliable, unglamorous demand, rather than any particular interest in sporting goods whatsoever. In 1880, Hillerich's own son, John A. Hillerich, known to nearly everyone who worked alongside him as Bud, began apprenticing at his father's shop at just 14 years old, learning the same lathe-turning trade his own father had already spent decades perfecting on bedposts and bowling pins, rather than anything resembling sporting equipment of any kind. Bud, unlike his father, happened to be a genuine and enthusiastic baseball fan, and on a sunny afternoon in 1884, at 17 years old, he slipped away from his work at the shop, without permission, to watch Louisville's own major league team, the Louisville Eclipse, play a game. During that game, according to the story the company still tells visitors at its own museum today, star player Pete Browning broke his bat in the middle of the contest and fell into a visible, genuinely worrying batting slump almost immediately afterward. The kind of misfortune that could easily derail a hitter's confidence for weeks at a stretch. Bud, watching from the stands with a lathe operator's practical eye rather than simply a fan's ordinary enthusiasm, offered to have his father's shop turn Browning a brand new bat built entirely to his own specific preferences for weight and shape. Browning accepted the offer without hesitation, took the brand new bat into his very next game, and immediately broke out of his slump entirely. A turnaround, vivid and immediate enough that word of it spread quickly through the rest of the team and the surrounding local baseball world within a matter of days. J.F. Hillerich himself was not particularly pleased about any of this at the time, whatever his own son's growing enthusiasm for the idea happened to be. He saw his company's real future in stair railings, porch columns, and swinging butter churns, the steady, unglamorous woodworking trade that had actually built the entire business from nothing in the first place, decades earlier. For a brief period in the 1880s, he reportedly turned away ball players who came looking for custom bats of their own, viewing the whole idea as a distraction from the shop's real, dependable, established business rather than a genuine opportunity worth seriously pursuing at the time. Bud, though, could see the potential clearly enough from his own vantage point closer to the sport than his father had ever bothered to get, and the elder Hillerich eventually relented, allowing his son to keep making bats alongside the shop's more traditional woodworking orders, rather than shutting the promising idea down entirely the way he initially seemed inclined to do at first. The early bats were sold under the name Falls City Slugger, a regional name tied to Louisville's own popular nickname as the Falls City, owing to the nearby falls on the Ohio River just outside town. Before Bud formally took over his father's company outright in 1894 and registered a new, more ambitious trademark that would eventually become one of the most recognized names in all of American sports: Louisville Slugger. The company's next major leap forward came in 1905, and it was a genuinely consequential first for the entire advertising industry, not just for baseball or for Hillerich's own growing business. Honus Wagner, the legendary Pittsburgh Pirates shortstop known across the league as the Flying Dutchman and a five-time reigning National League batting champion at the time, signed a contract allowing Hillerich's company to put his own signature directly onto Louisville Slugger bats sold in stores across the country. It was, by most accounts from historians of both baseball and advertising, the first time any professional athlete anywhere had formally endorsed a commercial product with his own name and signature attached to it for sale, a marketing arrangement so genuinely novel at the time that nobody directly involved in negotiating it could have fully appreciated they were establishing a business practice that would eventually become standard across nearly every major sport in the world. From cleats and gloves to energy drinks and entire clothing lines, built around a single star athlete's personal brand. What started as a relatively modest deal between one Pittsburgh shortstop and a single Louisville woodworking company had, within a few decades, become the template nearly every major sporting goods company on earth would eventually follow in some form, whether selling shoes, gloves, rackets, or eventually clothing lines built entirely around one athlete's personal name and reputation rather than the product's own features. In 1911, a successful salesman named Frank Bradsby, who had previously worked as one of the largest buyers of Hillerich's own bats for a distribution business of his own before joining the company directly, brought with him exactly the kind of professional sales and marketing expertise the Hillerich family had never developed on their own across two full generations of skilled woodworking craftsmanship. The Hillerichs, father and son both, had proven themselves to be genuinely excellent at the actual craft of making bats, turning consistently balanced, well-shaped pieces of ash on a lathe with real skill and evident pride in the finished product. But building and running a genuine national sales operation capable of reaching stores, teams, and individual players across the entire country was a fundamentally different skill set entirely, one neither Hillerich had any particular training or natural aptitude in. And Bradsby's arrival filled that specific gap almost immediately once he formally came aboard the company. 5 years later, in 1916, the company formally changed its name to Hillerich and Bradsby, reflecting the genuine partnership that had already begun reshaping the business's growth, its distribution reach, and its overall reputation across the country in ways the original woodworking shop alone could never have achieved on its own. The First World War pulled the company into producing equipment for American troops alongside its ordinary bat-making business, a first taste of wartime manufacturing that would prove useful practice for the considerably larger and more demanding effort still to come a generation later, once the country found itself at war again. When the Second World War arrived 2 decades after that first experience, Hillerich and Bradsby converted a meaningful share of its wood-turning capacity toward the war effort once again, this time producing M1 carbine gun stocks, track pins for military tanks, and billy clubs for the armed forces, all built using essentially the same precision wood lathe turning skill the company had been refining continuously since J.F. Hillerich's original job turning shop decades earlier, simply redirected toward a rifle stock's exact required dimensions instead of a bat's. The same rotating blade and the same trained pair of hands, solving a completely different problem for an entirely different kind of customer than any ball player had ever been. The company kept making baseball and softball bats for American troops stationed overseas throughout the war as well, understanding that morale and ordinary recreation mattered even in the middle of a global conflict that had reordered nearly every other part of daily life back home. And, as in so many American factories during this same period, the severe labor shortage created by so many men serving overseas meant Hillerich and Bradsby employed women on its factory floor for the very first time in the company's entire history. A workforce change that, as in other American manufacturing companies of the era, would leave a lasting mark on the plant's culture and hiring practices well after the war itself had finally ended and the men had come home. The company's relationship with individual professional players went well beyond a single endorsement contract here and there over the following decades of the 20th century. Major league players routinely submitted their own precise specifications directly to the Louisville factory. Exact weight, length, handle diameter, and barrel shape preferences recorded and kept carefully on file, so that a player could reorder an identical bat season after season without needing to describe his preferences from scratch every single time. Essentially a running, decades-deep customer record for some of the most famous hitters in the entire sport's history. Some of those specifications, including detailed measurements for players like Babe Ruth himself, remain part of the company's own historical archive today, a strange and remarkably specific kind of institutional memory that few other manufacturers in any industry maintain with quite the same reverence for their own individual customers across so many decades. Making a single wooden bat properly, even after all the marketing and endorsement deals were in place, remained a genuinely demanding technical process in its own right. One considerably more involved than simply spinning a random chunk of wood on a lathe until it looked roughly bat-shaped and calling it finished. Selecting the raw billet mattered enormously to the finished product's performance and durability. Northern white ash was the traditional wood of choice for most of the 20th century, prized for a favorable combination of hardness, flexibility, and relatively lightweight compared to denser hardwoods that might have held up under impact, but felt too heavy for a batter to swing quickly enough. And the orientation of the wood's own natural growth rings within a finished bat directly affected how well it could withstand the repeated shock of solid contact with a thrown baseball without splintering or cracking prematurely partway through a season. A skilled lathe operator turning a bat needed to account for that internal grain structure while simultaneously shaping the bat to a specific player's requested weight, overall length, and handle thickness, since even a few fractions of an ounce placed in the wrong part of the bat could throw off a professional hitter's entire swing timing in ways only the player himself might notice at first. Maple eventually became a popular alternative wood choice in more recent decades, prized by many players for its harder, denser surface, and the slightly different feel it gave at the point of contact, though it also proved more prone to snapping in a single sudden dramatic shatter, rather than a slower, more gradual crack the way ash typically failed. A genuine safety trade-off. The sport's own equipment officials have continued debating and studying at length in the years since maple bats became widespread at the professional level. It was, in other words, precision manufacturing dressed up in a decidedly unglamorous, workshop floor kind of craftsmanship, closer in spirit to the exacting tolerances chased by machine tool builders elsewhere in this history than to simple woodworking, even though the finished product looked, to an outside observer standing at a store display, like nothing more complicated than a smooth wooden stick with a company name burned into its surface. Hillerich and Bradsby was never the only company making baseball bats in this era, and it is worth noting the company operated inside a genuinely competitive trade rather than simply inventing a market nobody else had noticed or attempting to enter. Rival bat makers came and went across the following decades, some backed by other sporting goods manufacturers with considerably larger overall resources and national distribution networks already in place. But none of them managed to build the same combination of on-field credibility earned through professional endorsements, manufacturing consistency at genuine scale, and brand recognition among ordinary amateur players buying a bat for their own weekend games rather than simply watching a professional swing one on television. That combination, rather than any single patented innovation, is probably the best explanation for why one particular Louisville woodworking shop ended up dominating an entire sports equipment for the better part of a century, while its competitors gradually faded from most fans' memory entirely. The post-war decades were, in nearly every sense that mattered to the company's public reputation, its genuine golden age, a stretch of decades in which the Louisville Slugger name became almost synonymous with the sport of baseball itself in the American popular imagination. Louisville Slugger bats became the overwhelming favorite of the sport's greatest players across the following half-century, a roster that reads like a history of baseball itself. Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Jackie Robinson, Roberto Clemente, Hank Aaron, George Brett, Ken Griffey Jr., and Derek Jeter all swung Louisville Slugger bats at various points across their own careers, an unbroken thread of association between one Kentucky company's product and the sport's most recognizable names, stretching back to that first Honus Wagner endorsement in 1905 and continuing essentially uninterrupted for the rest of the 20th century and well into the next one. In 1970, the company branched out beyond wood entirely for the first time in its history, entering the market for aluminum bats just as that material began genuinely reshaping amateur and collegiate baseball at every level below the professional ranks, offering a durability wood simply could not match for a bat that would be handed between dozens of different young players over the course of a single season, rather than treated with the individual care a professional might give his own personal equipment. The growing production demands of running two entirely distinct product lines side by side, one in traditional ash and maple, the other in cast and machined aluminum, eventually pushed the company to relocate its manufacturing operation across the Ohio River into southern Indiana, where it remained from 1970 until 1995, simply needing considerably more physical floor space than its original, increasingly cramped downtown Louisville facility could realistically offer any longer, as both product lines kept growing in parallel. In 1996, Hillerich and Bradsby moved back across the river into a new headquarters at 800 West Main Street in downtown Louisville, roughly 7 blocks from the site of the original carpentry shop where J.F. Hillerich had first started turning bedposts and bowling pins nearly a century and a half earlier. That same location still houses the company today as the Louisville Slugger Museum and Factory, instantly recognizable to visitors approaching from any direction downtown by the presence of the big bat, a scaled-up steel recreation of a genuine Louisville Slugger leaning against the side of the building and standing tall enough to be seen clearly from several blocks away, functioning as both a genuine architectural landmark for the city and an unmistakable, unmissable piece of advertising in its own right. More than 4 million visitors have toured the combined museum and working factory at that location since it first opened its doors in 1996. Watching real bats still being turned on real lathes, only a short walk from displays covering the exact same company history being described here. A rare case of a manufacturer turning its own working factory floor into one of an entire region's most popular tourist attractions, rather than hiding its production process away from public view behind closed doors, the way most companies of comparable scale eventually choose to do once tours start to feel like more trouble than they are worth. Which brings the story back to the quiet contradiction sitting underneath all of that remarkable continuity. Despite surviving every major disruption in its own industry's long history. Wars, a nationwide economic depression that emptied the pockets of most of its customers, and a complete material shift from wood to aluminum that could easily have made half its product line obsolete overnight if the company had failed to adapt in time, all without ever being acquired, broken apart, or forced into a distant conglomerate's unrelated portfolio, the way so many comparable American manufacturers covered elsewhere in this history eventually were. Hillerich and Bradsby made a quiet decision in 2015 that permanently ended one specific piece of its 121-year ownership history, a decision that received relatively little public attention or fanfare at the time, given how unglamorous and administrative it sounded compared to a dramatic bankruptcy filing or a hostile takeover battle. That year, the company sold the actual Louisville Slugger brand and trademark outright to Wilson Sporting Goods, a major American sporting goods manufacturer with no historical connection to the Hillerich family or to Frank Bradsby's own descendants at all. Wilson now legally owns the name itself, the exact same 3 words Bud Hillerich had first registered as a formal trademark back in 1894, after his own father finally stopped turning ball players away from the shop entirely, and every single bat carrying that name sold anywhere in the world today is, in the strict eyes of trademark law, technically a Wilson product, rather than a Hillerich and Bradsby one, regardless of where it was actually made or by whose hands it was actually turned. What Hillerich and Bradsby actually kept, and what the sale agreement specifically preserved for the family in the negotiation, was the manufacturing itself. The family-owned factory in downtown Louisville still turns every single official Louisville Slugger bat by an ongoing manufacturing contract signed with Wilson, meaning the company that invented the product from scratch built its entire reputation from nothing over 12 full decades, and made the name genuinely famous across the whole sport of baseball no longer owns the three words stamped into the wood of its own bats, even though its own hands, in its own factory, in the same downtown Louisville neighborhood where it all began a century and a half earlier, are still the ones actually doing every bit of the physical work of making them today. There is a genuinely rare kind of survival story sitting inside that arrangement, one considerably quieter and far less dramatic than the bankruptcies, hostile takeovers, and conglomerate dismemberments that ended so many other companies covered elsewhere in this entire history. Hillerich and Bradsby did not fail, and nothing about the 2015 sale reads as a company in financial distress, looking for any deal it could get. It is still a privately held business today, still in its fifth consecutive generation of unbroken family ownership, with John A. Hillerich IV, the great-grandson of Bud Hillerich himself, serving as the company's president and chief executive officer, continuously since 2001, a direct, unbroken line of family leadership running from a 19th-century immigrant woodworker's reluctant tolerance of his own teenage son's baseball hobby all the way to a 21st-century corporate boardroom, without a single generation in between ever losing meaningful control of the business entirely to an outside buyer. The company has also continued diversifying quietly in the years since the Wilson sale closed, building out a growing line of Bionic-branded gloves for golf, cycling, general fitness, and gardening. Clear evidence that the family business is still actively searching for its own next chapter and its own new revenue streams, rather than simply coasting indefinitely on 170 years of baseball history and a museum full of famous names and autographed memorabilia. And yet somewhere along that remarkably stable, remarkably unbroken family lineage, 5 generations deep and still counting today, the company decided the name itself, the 3 words that had defined its entire public identity since 1894 and had been proudly endorsed by some of the greatest athletes in American sporting history, was worth more sold away to someone else than kept for its own sake and its own pride. A strange, understated kind of transaction for a business that had, by every other measure available to judge it by, spent 160 years refusing to let go of anything at all, including a struggling small woodworking trade its own founder never particularly wanted to leave behind in the first place, back in the 1880s.